This is For Keeps, a podcast about collections and connections. I'm David Peterkowski. This is a collector's story featuring two men whose paths converged, at least indirectly, because of their sense of adventure. One was an American entrepreneur who brought his creativity and knack for business to a small kingdom looking to raise money and its visibility. And the other is a Dutchman who's devoted much of his life to public service, a calling that led him to that same kingdom where collectibles created by the American entrepreneur captured his imagination. The kingdom in question is Bhutan, the tiny Asian nation sandwiched between China and India and known for the happiness of its inhabitants. The American was Burt Todd, a charismatic businessman who ran an importing and manufacturing company in the Pittsburgh area, but who may be best known for coming up with a unique way to raise public funds for Bhutan, a place he fell in love with when he became the first American to visit the peaceful country back in 1951. In the mid-1960s, Todd, who had endeared himself to the Bhutanese royal family, encouraged the kingdom to embrace the production and sale of postage stamps as a way to generate much-needed funds. And then, eager to make a splash among stamp collectors, Todd oversaw the creation of some of the most unusual stamps the world has ever seen. Thanks to Todd, from the mid-60s through the mid-70s, Bhutan produced 3D stamps, plastic stamps, scented stamps, stamps made of rayon meant to evoke silk Bhutanese tapestries, triangular stamps celebrating the abominable snowman, and even an ill-fated stamp filled with a liquid gel that changed color depending on its temperature. But perhaps Burt Todd's best-known creation was his series of so-called talking stamps, actual postage made from small, playable vinyl records. One talking stamp featured the voice of the third king of Bhutan, another played the Bhutanese national anthem, and there was even one stamp that had the voice of Burt Todd himself, giving a short history of the kingdom. Not long after Todd's death in 2006, Bhutan offered his last postal innovation, a CD-ROM stamp, which featured videos on the country and its history. Originally dismissed as novelties by serious stamp collectors, the Bhutanese stamps of Burt Todd have since become highly coveted items. And that brings us to that Dutchman. His name is Leo Van der Velden, and his work for the United Nations World Food Program led to assignments around the world: Bangladesh, Somalia, even North Korea. But from 1996 to 1999, and again from 2007 to 2009, he was stationed in Bhutan, and it was during his second stint there that his childhood interest in stamp collecting was reignited. Leo's knowledge of Bhutan's relatively young history of stamp production is as good as anybody's, and his sizable stamp collection includes at least one of every stamp that Burt Todd produced for the kingdom in his heyday. These days, Leo, who's now retired and writes articles for journals devoted to stamp history, spends most of the year with his family in Kampala, Uganda, and that's where he was when I reached out to him to hear all about his collection and his connection to Bhutan and Burt Todd, as well as tales of his own globe-trotting adventures. Like many collectors, Leo developed an interest in stamp collecting, or philately to use the proper name for it, at a young age.
I collected stamps, of course, especially of the Netherlands, but also of the surrounding countries in Europe and in principle worldwide. That was more or less how it was done in those days.
And what motivated you to begin?
Well, my uncle, he was a real collector. He had thick books of several countries, which were quite all right. And I came in his house because he had also a collection of comic books, which was not common in Holland. And I was very interested to read them. And that's how I saw also his albums with stamps. Those days, of course, stamp collecting was very common. It was a very popular hobby.
As an adult, Leo's work for the World Food Program led him to move around quite a bit, including to some challenging locations, some of which you might also describe as being postally challenged. What were some of the more interesting places where you were stationed for your work? I think Somalia offered some interesting experiences.
Well, I started in Sudan, and that was interesting because I didn't collect as such anymore, but I still had a kind of interest in postage stamps. So I went there to the post office, and they had very old stamps in full sheets, which I chose from them, a number of them, because I thought maybe I could frame them. They were really beautiful. Old type, the camel postman is very well known for Sudan. So that's what I still had. I started in Sudan, but Somalia had no post office. There was no postal services. But as far as work is concerned, was Somalia, of course, very interesting. There, if you know how to deal with the people, you can really do a lot there. It was a little bit insecure, but they guarantee your security, and that they take that literally. They all have a weapon, concealed weapon, and if necessary, they will use it for you.
Weapons and security weren't an issue in 1996, when Leo first made his way to Bhutan to serve as the country director for the World Food Program's efforts in the remote, isolated kingdom. And when he arrived, he saw opportunities to make a difference, even developing a slogan to entice donors to support the program's vital work.
Bhutan, of course, was very exotic, and it was really progressive. I made a slogan for the donors. Bhutan is a success story, be part of the success. And I think donors are really looking for a success story as well. I think that's how Bhutan, even though it was progressing very fast, and it had quite some income from production of electricity from their waterworks, the hydro plants. So it's a really exotic country, progressive country in a way, in the sense of development. And from the other side, it's very beautiful, and it's exotic with their Tibetan Buddhism, which is also a kind of philosophy, but it's also very colorful, especially, and a lot of music and sound and dance.
Being in Bhutan was new and exciting for Leo, and it renewed an old passion of his fairly quickly. That was right around the time you started stamp collecting again, is that accurate?
Yes. You know what happened is that two of my sons stayed behind in Holland to go to school there, because at that time there was no international school in Bhutan, and the local schools were still developing. So I tried to send them almost every week a kind of medium-sized envelope with a comic book, which was printed in India. You could buy them there. And then I tried to put on each of them different stamps. And that's how I got in touch with the Philatelic Bureau again. And from one thing comes the other. I had not much time to really go deep into it, but I took a subscription on their stamps, and that's indeed how it started. And only the second time, when I was there in 2007 to 2009, that's when I really had time to look at what I had and to develop it, and also to start writing about it.
And had you known much about Bhutan's philatelic history at that point?
No, nothing really. The second time when I was there, I became a kind of member of a small group of 8 collectors of Bhutanese postage stamps, especially also because I was in Bhutan. And it was just at a time when there was a lot of developments again. There was the crowning of the 5th king, the young king, in 2008. And that also went together with a number of interesting stamps, which were developed by the daughter of the person, Burt Todd, who developed the first stamps of Bhutan in the 60s and early 70s. And also what they started with at that time was these personal stamp sheets that you could, put your picture on a stamp as a real stamp. So there were a lot of things going on at those days, and that's how you get more into it. And I really got completely stuck to it in that sense. What I also did at those days, because I was traveling around, I went to visit each and every post office or postal agencies which I could. And I made pictures, I interviewed the people, and later on I published that as well.
So you were a casual stamp collector who happened to wind up in the most interesting stamp-producing country in the world.
Yeah, that's how you could see it, because I was also a student in the Philippines in the 70s, and I went also to the Philatelic Bureau there, and I bought a lot of first day covers and stamps, but it was all a little bit dull. There was not really much of interest, except maybe the topic, because they put a lot of national heroes on their stamps. But later on, Bhutan, together with the country itself, and then their stamps, that really became very interesting.
Uh-huh. So let's talk a bit about Burt Todd. What are your impressions of his work in the kingdom?
Well, he was familiar with Bhutan. He got very interested in it. And then the whole changes came up in early 1960s, because of India and China, the rivalry. And in 1959, Tibet was completely taken over by China. So there were a lot of things going on. And Bhutan was still, very, it had no motorable roads. You had to go on horseback or mule or walk in order to go around. So it was especially instigated by the Indians. The development started in those days. And one part of this development plan was the development of the postal services. You had at one side an Indian advisor who set up the postal services. And then you had Burt Todd, who was a friend of the king and the queen, who came up with the idea, let's use the postage stamps also to make some money, which could also assist in the development. That's how Burt Todd came into it. He was an entrepreneur, an adventurer, and he saw this also, I think, as an adventure. And I think he did very well at the end.
Burt Todd's work on the stamps for the kingdom began in a fairly conventional way, but market forces led the entrepreneur to pursue the wow factor, and so he began to think outside the mailbox.
He started with a little bit normal stamps in that sense, very nicely designed, but when he saw that it had not much influence in the philatelic market in the States, he changed towards using special materials, which was not common at all at those days. The first thing he did was this kind of gold foil. They were the second, because the first were in Tonga. Then what he did was this kind of 3D stamps as well, where the topic was space travel in those days, which was just coming up. And then he started with steel, which Burt Todd was from Pittsburgh area, where there was steel factories. So he came up with the idea of using very thin steel foil, and it should have been stainless, but some of them have been rusting. So that's a question mark. But then also he went further, with the introduction of the tanka. The tanka is a traditional Bhutanese painting of either an unholy man or the Buddha itself. Also, sometimes a kind of abstract Buddhist figures.
Todd got more unconventional over time, taking inspiration from the world around him, including on a business trip to Japan, which led him to create another 3D stamp of a different kind.
He came also with this heat-molded plastic, which also had a kind of 3D effect. He had also the first perfumed stamps, which later on also were introduced in Europe. And the most famous one, I think, is what they call the talking stamps, of the gramophone stamps. These were these real playing gramophones, which he then made into stamps, which you could really play.
The Kingdom of Bhutan, Drugyul, or Land of Dragons, is a landlocked country of 18,000 square miles in the heart of the Himalayas. India is to the south and east, China to the north, and Sikkim to the west. The country rises in steps from the densely wooded foothills to snow-capped giant mountains. The Bhutanese people, numbering approximately 1 million, are a strong and well-built race whose religion is Buddhism.
And those ones have become a kind of collecting item, especially also for those who collect old-time gramophone records. That's a little bit what happened in those days. He went even after materials which then didn't work out. One very well-known one was a kind of material which, if you would touch it, it would change color. It was liquid crystal in between very thin plastic, which really would change color. But then when they produced them, well, they were not really printed well, but also the effect was not really good. So those ones never saw daylight, although they have been announced in 1973, but they were withdrawn. They were printed already, everything was ready, but they were withdrawn because the effect was not right. But that shows how he was looking always out for new materials and new ideas.
Burt Todd stamps were only manufactured for a short period of time, but the stamps themselves remained in postal circulation, those liquid crystal ones aside, for Leo to collect while he was working in Bhutan's capital, Thimphu.
These stamps were still available at the Philatelic Bureau in the 1990s. Even the talking stamp, I bought a few at a post office in Paro. That's one of the bigger cities where the airport is even. And so those stamps were still available in Bhutan in the 90s. So that's how I got to see them. And they're just part of the early days. Burt Todd was in charge of designing, printing, and the sales outside Bhutan and India, so the international sales, from 1962 till early 1974. What happened was his friend, the third king, died, and he had some problems with the bureaucratic Indian advisor before already. So once the third king died, his contract a year later was annulled.
After that annulment, a new postal agency, the Intergovernmental Postal Corporation, entered the picture, and only 2 more stamps produced by Todd were issued in Bhutan, at least until the CD-ROM stamp was issued decades later.
So after Burt Todd, we saw a long period of what we can call, in general, wallpaper by the IGPC, who has been doing that for a number of other countries as well. There has been a few interesting things in between, but it was very, very seldom. Only in 2008 we got this world's first again with a CD-ROM, and it was done by the daughter of Burt Todd, Frances Todd Stewart. She also produced some normal stamps in those days, but that was really something special again.
In addition to raising money for Bhutan, the stamps enabled the kingdom to make a name for itself on the world stage.
Another thing which was of interest for Bhutan itself was to put Bhutan on the world map. Independent India inherited an agreement between Bhutan and the British India that British India would look after their foreign relations. And that was, of course, a little bit problematic if you're an independent country. So through independently producing stamps with their own currency, that way they could also make a statement. And also through that way, they became a member of international organizations. First, the Universal Postal Union, only in 69. They started in 62, but only in 69 did they become a member of the UPU. And then in 1971 of the United Nations itself. So you see that this was a first step towards a greater recognition of Bhutan as such.
So let's talk specifically about some of the Bhutanese stamps in your collection. Which ones would you say are ones you're especially proud of?
Well, of course, talking stamps are nice because it's a very special one. But I would say in overprint, there are several overprints which are interesting because there are always differences. If you have a full sheet, you can see how it was done and where there were, say, problems, which, especially if you see several sheets, you can see that it's not an just a one-time off mistake, but that it really is a problem in the full printing. So in that sense, overprints are often very interesting, more interesting than just a stamp which is the same all the time, where you have seldom differences. The overprints started in Bhutan because Burt Todd was especially looking at the international market. Of course, in order to sell them for a little bit price, they had to make quite high face value stamps. And for the local market, which was really starting to develop, because they had a lot of teachers, especially from India in the beginning, and they would write to India. And in that sense, they needed also the local face values. So that the first overprints were the surcharges, the lower face values for the domestic use. Of course, they're all very interesting, especially like the steel stamps are also interesting because even though most people don't know, it was done in cooperation with, at the start with Disney. But also the tankas, of course, it's exactly like in tanka, like this Buddhist painted scroll you have and you can hang on the wall. And the first perfume stamps are also recognized later on in foreign countries. Germany had a telephone card with that stamp and with written on it, the first perfume stamp in the world. So the number of first, which then came, well, the perfume stamp especially has been copied a lot. But if you would really ask me which stamps are of really interest, that would be the overprints. And especially like the overprints which have more than only the overprint of a new face value, but also a little bit an overprint of a figure or a kind of small figurative emblem on it.
I want to circle back to the talking stamps. Can you describe what they look like and how they're used? I think people who don't know much about stamp collecting might have a difficult time imagining how they work.
Well, in those days, you could get some, it started in Japan, that they would put these carton gramophone records in a magazine, and you could just play them. So they are 10 centimeters maybe in diameter. So they're quite big. Some are smaller, but the biggest, they're quite big. You could just play them on a typical old-time gramophone.
Were they attached to a cover, or were they just stamps?
No, they were just stamps. They were just sold independently as a stamp. It was not like later on, in 2008, the CD-ROM stamp, which was in a cover. The CD-ROM itself was in a cover. But these ones were real. The glue was at the backside. So don't make it wet at the backside because it will glue on paper or other stuff. But these ones were really stamps in that sense. The collection of vinyl records, somehow the same collectors started to collect these Bhutan talking stamps as well, partly because there were a number of articles in their magazines about this particular talking stamps. And that's how the prices went up and up of the talking stamp set.
So the two worlds kind of combined.
Yes, indeed.
The record collectors ruin everything. And how about the textile stamps that were made with fabrics? Do you have any of those?
Yes, sure. I even have, they made these, in those days they make these flyers for the stamps, but also these presentation folders. That was very common in the 60s. So I have those. They are made from, they call them silk stamps, but they're made from rayon, from this artificial material, no?
Rayon,
yeah.
Interesting. And there was an abominable snowman stamp, is that accurate?
That it was a triangle stamp, and it was the Yeti stamp in short. That was one of his start, but that's how he started with the changes in, say, from normal stamps, he went to this triangle stamp. And of course, the idea of this Yeti, to take the Yeti as a topic, was interesting. It was a topic which other people would have an interest in. It. You have the same things, I think, Bigfoot in the States and so on. So it's connected to the rest of the world in that sense. It had a kind of mystery with it.
Yes, indeed. Leo is far from alone in his interest in the unusual stamps of Bhutan. And, thanks to the internet and social media, he's found his tribe.
First, there was a small group which was active, but since we then went to Facebook and we made there a kind of page, Bhutan Stamp Collectors, then it was really growing well. still that the original members always have to push others to publish things on Facebook, or even publish this in a magazine which is interested in Tibet, Nepal, Sikkim and Bhutan. It's Postal Himal. It's a quarterly. And even there, I have to push other people to publish about Bhutan. But there's a lot of interest. So you can see that we are not in just a small number. It's around 700 at the moment.
Uh-huh. And you're all over the world.
Yes. And for me, it's even a little bit problematic is that at the moment, part of the year, I'm living in Uganda, while my collection is in Holland. I go to Holland 2-3 months per year. And that's, I have my collection with my son, and also all the new stamps and the new purchases I do, they all go to Holland. So I make especially a lot of scans, and then here I might make stories about stamps I only have here in my computer in that sense. That's why I think I'm also have to work together with other people, because if I need a scan of something special, I have to ask other people to do so. So that's, you will see that my publications are almost all with other people together.
So you're not just a collector, you're a historian.
Yeah. Yeah. For me, it comes together. You know, the collection, it brings things to life. If you have one stamp, but if you have a number of stamps, you can say something already about it. The more you go into something, and especially if you include also other people, what they know, then you get new knowledge and encouragement about the whole stamp collection in that sense. It comes to life.
So I have a bigger picture question here. Does it seem strange or out of character to you that a country like Bhutan, which for centuries remained closed off to outside influences, wanted to make a name for itself internationally through postage stamps of all things?
Well, they were very not known in that sense, no, to the world. So if you want to become more independent, and you have to make friends abroad, and you have to get known. And I think that's a very good way of doing it. The royal family in Bhutan is very progressive, and they really want to develop the country. So that's a completely different picture from what was there before in the region. You know, the development of the postage stamps in the beginning had the backing of the king, because the king gave his go-ahead for each issue also, either in general or in very particular even. So in that sense, it had the royal backing. Burt Todd had the royal backing. And in that way, he was able to produce also these special stamps, even though the bureaucratic Indian influence on the postal services, they were not liking it.
So this image I have in my mind of the old Bhutan wanting to be separate and not having television and sort of resisting the outside influences, that wasn't the case?
Well, the whole idea of the king is that if the capital has internet or TV, then the whole country should be able to have it. And you know, it's very remote and a lot of high mountains there. So to develop these things is not easy. So even with the telephone, they made satellite telephones in the health centers so that each village even, or in real rural areas, there was a way that you could make use of a telephone in the very beginning. So that the whole idea about the development should be all over the country and not only in the capital, that has delayed maybe certain things. And also they wanted to be sure that the population was ready for it. And you should know that the public education started only in 1962. Before there was hardly any school. And the king chose English because he said, we are a small country. If we choose Hindi, nobody will know us, and we will not know all the rest of the world. But if we choose English as the language of instruction and even the language of the government, then we are open to the world.
Uh-huh. So I want to switch things up a little bit and ask you, what brought you to Uganda?
Oh, Doctors Without Borders. My first work was in 1986. I was stationed in Khartoum, and that's where I met my wife, whose family is originally from South Sudan. Before South Sudan became independent, I could become the coordinator for South Sudan and later on then the acting country director when it became independent in July 2011. It was a non-family duty station, which means that the family has to be somewhere else. So that's how we came to Kampala. And because of all the troubles in South Sudan, we never made it to South Sudan. So we stayed here in exile in a certain way.
And I understand you collect stamps from South Sudan as well.
Yes, that was also a colleague of mine who is a very well-known collector of stamps of Sudan. He wrote to me in those days. He said, South Sudan is becoming independent. For sure, they're going to issue stamps. Could you buy some for me? And then he sent me $100. And I thought, gee, you really want something? What happened was, of the first issue already, one of the 3 stamps was withdrawn. And I thought, it becomes even interesting here. Later on, I have become a little bit kind of advisor to the postal services of South Sudan. I assist them a little bit because they're completely out of money and out of anything. But I'm also advising Bhutan Post at the Bhutan Museum. I'm helping them a little bit. So I keep in touch with both sides.
So have you suggested to South Sudan maybe they do some talking stamps or some abominable snowman stamps?
No, it's a very different circumstances. There's no king who is behind it. So it goes all very slow. There is also nowadays, of course, also the philatelic market, and that sense is much smaller than in those days in the 60s, 70s.
Although Leo never got to meet Burt Todd, he did get to meet Todd's daughter, Frances Todd Stewart, who produced the CD-ROM stamp for Bhutan following her father's death. Leo met her when she came to Thimphu for the coronation of the new king.
Yeah, that was in 2008. I was, in those days, country director for the World Food Program in Thimphu. And I heard about this CD-ROM stamp. The main post office is just 2 buildings further than our office building from the United Nations in Thimphu. So I was quite often in the post office and general post office. So they told me, this lady is around and so on. So that's how I said, maybe I can meet her. So that's how I met her, and we talked a little bit about the past and the present, and it was very interesting.
She probably felt like she had a fan.
Yeah, at that time, there were 2 other of our group were in Thimphu because of the coronation, and so we all met with her later on. She was also, of course, of interest that a number of well-known collectors were going to meet her in Thimphu. It's very interesting.
So, one last question for you. Bhutan is a country that's known for having high levels of happiness among its residents, and I'm wondering, were you happy in Bhutan, and what would you say makes this small kingdom have such a sunny reputation?
Well, it's true. Bhutan is a happy country. It's the people, it's the nature, it's beautiful, the exotic Tibetan Buddhism which they have. It comes all together, and they're very friendly, they're very cooperative, and I think also because of the leadership, which is very progressive and down to earth. The king came there when he was for part of the coronation. I was just there along the road with a lot of Bhutanese, and he came to me. He was there with a minister next to him who I knew, and the minister said, there you have that guy from World Food Program. So he came to talk to me. But he also was talking to everybody along the route. So he's very down to earth and very progressive, and there really a lot of good ideas. There's hardly any corruption, for instance. And in that sense, it's really a good atmosphere. Of course, the foreigners cannot stay there just like that. You have to have a reason to be there. I've been invited several times with the National Happiness Commission, but they locked the country almost for 2 years now because of COVID. no mail going out almost. So I have to see when I can go back again. It will take some time, but it's a beautiful country, beautiful people, and a great leadership on all sides.
You sound as enthusiastic about it as Burt Todd was.
Well, at that time, of course, he had to go on horseback and walking. And nowadays they have roads and they have nice hotels and you can make it exactly like you want. But in those days, it was a completely different picture. And even in the 90s, it was still a country on the go, on the development.
So there's been some progress.
There's a lot of progress. When I was there the first time, it was something like 55% of the children were for the right age in the primary school. The second time, it was something like 92%. So there's really an unbelievable progress in the whole country. And of course, the healthcare is free and it's really there. It's available. Then schooling is for free and it's also available. People don't have to worry about these basic things. Maybe that's also part of the background of being happy, is to have less worries.
I would think so. Well, Leo, that's everything I've got for you. I want to thank you so much for speaking with me about Bhutan, Burt Todd's stamp program, and how collecting stamps from Bhutan has improved your personal happiness index. I appreciate it.
Yeah, you're welcome. You're welcome. Okay, all the best. Yeah.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.
Well, let there be no doubt, Bhutan's two highest profile products are happiness and strange stamps. And clearly, the life of Leo Van der Velden has been enhanced by them both, as well as by his many years working in the kingdom. If the past is any indication, Leo's passion for collecting Bhutan stamps and sharing the stories of their unique history will continue to deliver. For Keeps is a production of me, David Peterkowski. My thanks to Leo Van der Velden for filling us in on the philatelic work of Burt Todd and his own collection of the unusual stamps of Bhutan, as well as the fascinating history behind them. At forkeepspodcast.com, you'll see photos of Leo, Burt Todd, and some of the more striking stamps from Leo's collection. The show's theme is by Still Flyin, and the closing theme is by Eric Frisch. Additional music for this episode was provided by Blue Dot Sessions and Sarang Norbu. You can visit the show online at forkeepspodcast.com or follow For Keeps on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at For Keeps Podcast. And if you're a fan of the show, post a positive review for it wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening to For Keeps. Until next time, keep on keeping on.